Hello and welcome to another Watercolour Wednesday with me, Rebecca Jarman. In today's free tutorial I'm going to teach you how to paint these really pretty blue poppies. It's an intermediate class, and also available to download is a free copy of the PDF reference image. So let's get started. Okay, so first I'll take you through all the materials you're going to need and equipment you're going to need to finish this painting today. If you haven't already, have a look in the description box below this video and you'll find a link to my reference image. Just click the link, download and print it at home. Then what you want to do is scribble on the back with a graphite pencil or a 9B pencil, cover the back entirely, place it down on your watercolour paper and trace the outline of those beautiful blue poppies there. So I've already done that. I've also stuck my paper down to a board so that it's nice and flat. The colours that I'm going to use in today's class is cerulean blue, turquoise, midnight green, viridian green and cadmium yellow. So you can obviously use any blues that you have in your palette. Cerulean blue is lovely. The turquoise, if you want to change the turquoise, you could use a phthalo blue or ultramarine blue to get that slightly darker blue shade. The midnight green you could swap for olive green or something like that. And usually palettes generally will come with some form of viridian green. You can also choose a totally different colour for your poppies if you want as well, you know, artistic license and all that. I'm just going to show you the techniques to use to get the right effects that you're after. So I have my old palette here because I'm using blues that I don't have in my regular palette. So here is the cerulean blue and here is my turquoise. I have the viridian here and midnight green there, and there's my cadmium yellow. I've got a selection of brushes, one small, medium and large round brush. I have a cloth to wipe my brushes on. I also have a bit of tissue paper as well if I need to blot my paintbrushes. And quite importantly, remember 2 water pots, one for cleaning your brush and one for mixing your colours. So once you've set up your workplace, we can get started. So I'm going to begin by working in layers. So the first layer is going to be the cerulean blue, and we're going to paint a wash over the blue petals. I'm going to paint around the centres. You see those green centres there and there. I'm going to leave those white. I'm going to apply the wash on the petals and not actually put any paint down where those green shapes are. So you want a really detailed drawing actually for this. I've got quite a lot of lines to follow if I give you a close-up of that. So you can see that I've put in some suggestive marks as well within the flowers. I've put in the overlapping lines so that I know where my lights and darks are. And I haven't added any of the linear elements around the seed heads. So this is a bud. That's a poppy waiting to emerge, but these are sort of the seed heads that once the petals have dropped. Now there's lots of fine linear details outside of those buds. I haven't drawn those in. I'm going to paint them freehand. I also haven't put any marks down with regard to these central elements other than the green shapes. I've left the sort of the stamen, I haven't drawn those in. I'm going to paint them again freehand afterwards. So let's get started on our first wash. I'm going to get some clean water and begin by just getting a puddle of cerulean blue going. So using a smaller brush to pick up my paint. So I've activated my paint a little bit with water, so it shouldn't take too much to pick up. And there we go with the cerulean blue. Now, the first wash is a light wash, so I want it to be dark enough so that it's obviously there on the page, but I don't want it to be too dark. So if I just pick up my tester strip here, let's have a look what I've got. So this is the cerulean blue at the top here. So I've got a nice pale shade of blue, and that's ideal for the first wash. Okay. It's a really hot day here, and because of that I'm going to wet the flower first, because otherwise I'm going to get hard lines. So if I begin with this flower in the foreground, right in the centre, I'm just taking a large brush and being careful where I place my water and just wetting that area. Because it's so hot, I probably won't wet the whole thing in one go because it's just going to dry so quickly. Just being careful around the centre there, because I don't want any of this blue wash to encroach on the green centre. So I've just wet the top section of that petal, that flower now, and I'm going to take a small brush into the blue and then paint that down. So I'm using a small brush because the edges are very irregular. There's lots of ins and outs, and obviously with the small brush you can control where that paint goes. So this one is a number 4. It's my Da Vinci Casaneo round brush, if anybody wants to check those out. I find them really nice to use. They're lovely and soft. They're synthetic, so they're not sable, but they act like a sable brush, so they're really lovely to use. So I'm going back to my big brush now, and I'm just wetting the next section. With some water, because that had already dried, that area. So just wetting that. This really is the best way to get a nice smooth even wash over this flower without getting any hard lines drying anywhere on you. So just be patient with it, and I'm going to continue in the same way, going around with that nice light cerulean blue. It'll flow into the wet paper and it won't go anywhere that's dry, so that's going to help you control your wash, which is really useful. So obviously with a small brush you've got to keep going back into your paint. You've got to keep going and reapplying more of that paint because you'll use it up quite quickly. And then I'm wetting the next, that's a bit too wet, wetting the next section. Use a nice largish round brush for wetting. You want to get the water on as quickly as possible. If you're using a round brush, then obviously it'll have a nice point, so you can control where you're putting that water. So there we go, so that's the last bit of wetting that I should need to do. Back into my blue with my small brush again, and just allowing that wash to fill the space. So just being a little bit more careful up to the edges. Now I don't mind having some pencil lines on my paintings. If you do, you want to make sure that you, if the lines are fairly dark and they're too dark, you don't like that, you can use a putty rubber before you start painting and just really lighten them up so that they're dark enough for you to see. And also you might find that you want to work just inside your lines, and then once the wash is dry you can go around and rub out the lines that haven't been painted over. I'm just making sure my edges are all nice and neat. Now it's starting to dry at the top and obviously the bottom is still wet. So what I'm going to do, a little tip for you guys, is I'm going to take my old palette, my other palette should I say, just tilt up my board a little bit so that I don't get a back run, because I do ideally want a flat wash here. But of course we've worked in sections, haven't we? And this section that we've just painted at the bottom is a lot wetter than the top section now. That's already beginning to dry. So by tipping my board, it's going to slow down any back washes and hopefully prevent any hard lines from appearing. And I'm going to go ahead and paint the other two poppies in exactly the same way. Just a quick reminder to you folks, if you've enjoyed my class so far, give me a thumbs up and a like. And if you'd like to see more free watercolour tutorials from me in the future, then subscribe to my channel and also click the bell too, and then you'll get a notification every time I upload another watercolour tutorial. Let's get back to this class now. As you can see, I continued on with the same technique and I have painted my wash over the other two poppies as well. So the next step is to paint the greens in the stems and the seed heads and things. So what I want to do is, so we always paint from light to dark. So I'm beginning with the Viridian green and I'm going to start in the foreground here with this this bud that's just opening up. Incidentally, you can see I've painted the blue there in the centre, the same as I did with the petals. So that's a cerulean blue. So we're going to get a little bit of Viridian green on the palette. Let's pop that down in here. There we go. So I always use a smaller brush just to pick up the paint. So my Viridian is right down here on my palette. And I want a pale wash again. Now on the palette it looks really dark, but if I were to show you on the paper how pale that is, you can see there. Look how pale that wash is. When you pull it out across the paper, it's much lighter. So I need to add a bit more paint to that. So bits at a time, a little bit at a time, until you get the consistency and colour that you want. So we want it to be very watery and pale, but it needs to be a little darker than that. So let's have a look there. So it's slightly darker. So that's the kind of colour you want to go for. And then what we'll do is we'll also at the same time mix a little bit of the darker green we're using, which is midnight green. So over here on my palette, I will mix up a small amount of this midnight green. So it's sort of got olivey tones in this one, so you could use an olive green. You could mix your colour, you could create this colour using the cadmium yellow and something like an ultramarine blue. You would get a similar colour as well. So have a little go at mixing that. Alternatively, use whatever green you have in your palette. You know, feel free to substitute any of these colours, it's absolutely fine. Again, this one you want it watery but not too pale, so that's perfect if you can see that there. So this one's slightly darker obviously than the Viridian, and we're going to use the two at the same time. In fact, I'm going to go a little darker, adding a bit more pigment to that midnight green so that it's a little bit darker. There we go. So a little bit darker. I wanted definite contrast between the two, and you'll see why now. So I've kept my board actually on a slight slope. So I'm just using my regular palette look. So it's maybe 2 centimeters deep, something like that. You could use a putty rubber or anything really, just to lift up the back edge. I just want to make sure you can still see me on camera there. That's fine. So a very slight slope, and that's just going to help stop any sort of hard lines occurring and things while we're painting. Now, just to let you know, I've elongated my stems a little bit because the image is slightly smaller than I wanted it. I wanted to have longer stems, so I've just carried them down to where it meets the masking tape. So to begin with then, on this particular bud in the foreground, I'm going to clean my brush and I'm going to I'm going to paint the stem first. So into clean water now with my small brush. I'm going to wet the stem just so that it's damp before I start, because honestly it's drying within seconds. If I were to try and paint this, it would just dry so quickly that I'd end up with a few hard lines before I have a chance to complete that little area of wash. So just dampened it down a little. Now I'm going to go into the pale colour first, so that's the Viridian. It looks dark in the palette, but we know it's nice and light. So the Viridian green, starting at the top and working my way down the stem. So I'm just filling out that top section first, making sure I've got that in, and then coming down the stem. So that bit of water that I put down is already pretty much dried. This is how quickly and how difficult it's going to be to paint in these conditions. Now I'm going straight into the dark green. I've not even washed my brush. I've picked up some of that dark green paint and I'm going to dab it into the light green where I can see that it's slightly darker, and it will give us sort of a natural blended wet in wet wash. So we'll have some darker areas, some lighter areas. Actually, I'm going to drag it all the way down that left hand side. It creates a nice sort of a shadow effect, and it gives the shape a little bit more 3 dimensions and a bit more interest. And then I'm going to paint the bud itself in exactly the same way. So cleaning off my brush now. I'm going to take my bigger brush for this. So this is the number 8 that I'm using to wet with. And I'm going to be really careful not to touch actually that wet paint I've just put down from the stem. So I'm just wetting almost to the stem, but not quite. I've left a little gap because otherwise this water will just run into that paint we've just applied on the stem and it will affect what we've put down. So I've just wet the outer, the bud itself, but I haven't wet obviously the blue in the middle. I'm going to go into my, so this is clean. Did I clean it? Just double check that it's clean. Into my light green. And I'm going to paint, I'm going to bring that paint all the way up now to the stem, so it's touching the stem there, and bringing that light green all the way across the flower bud. Okay, and the same over this side. See, that water is already dried, folks, on my paper. It's very difficult to paint when it's so hot, but I didn't want to not create a painting this week, so I've just got to bear with the conditions. So I've got to work with it as best I can. So you can see that's a nice even wash, and again I'm going to go into the dark green, and it's a lot darker. I'm just dabbing this paint down on the underside of the bud here. It's a lot darker down that side, so just letting that paint run into the lighter green. It's going to blend on the surface. There's always some, also some dark just running the centre there, and then the same thing again, just a little bit of a dark here. So just observe what you can see on the reference image and pop those darks down. Now that's really wet, so that's going to take a few minutes to dry. While that's drying, we can work on the other stems. So if we have a look at the reference image, they're really quite dark actually. So I'm probably going to just go straight in with my darker green, which is the midnight green, and not worry about the Viridian. So I'm just going to paint them in the same way, so wetting first, using my small brush, going to wet each stem before I apply some paint. So into the Viridian paint. Oh, sorry, that's my mistake. We want the dark green. What am I doing? I think it's this heat. It's driving me a little crazy. I bet you were screaming at the video then. It's the wrong green. So this is the dark green, and I'm just painting it in. Work your way from top to bottom. I've got a little hair. And that way you'll get a nice even coverage of paint, trying not to disturb what I've just painted as well, because that's still slightly damp. So sometimes it's much more helpful to turn your board so that you can get into those areas a little bit easier. Work with it that way, don't fight with it. There we go, so I can paint that in nice and easy. So I will do exactly the same thing across the rest of the stems. Okay, so as you can see, I've painted in the rest of the stems with the darker green, and I also use the Viridian green, the lighter green, to paint the centres of those two poppies. What I'm going to show you next is how to paint the seed heads. So on these three in the background, the petals of the poppies have actually dropped, and we're left with these seed heads. So the way we're going to approach this is a wet in wet technique. So you can see this one's quite yellow. So what we're going to do is mix up some cadmium yellow in the palette, and we're also going to use some of the darker greens. That's my midnight green, and whichever green you're using is the darker green colour. So I just want to make a little bit more of that on my palette there, because I'd used up the majority by painting the stems. So I've got a little bit more of the darker green, and I've also got my cadmium yellow as well. So once you've got that going, clean off your brush and clean water. So we're going to do the wet in wet technique because these two colours are sort of fused together on the surface. So I'm wetting the seed head from top to bottom. Just being careful up to the edges of the drawn lines. Okay. And what I'm going to do first is pick up the cadmium yellow, and I'm going to put that down across the whole seed head while that water's still wet. So that's gone down nicely. Now cleaning off my brush, and I'm going to go into the green, and I'm going to, a little bit like we did with this in the foreground here, wet into wet, I'm going to put down some green paint down the centre and allow it to run into the yellow. So you can see that it's splaying nicely there. I'm going to clean off my brush, and I'm going to just use a sort of a flicky technique. I'm trying to pull out some of that green across the seed head to create that texture. So there's lots of hairs on the seed head, and I'm just taking the bristles of my brush and I'm dragging some of that green outwards, and I'm also going to get some more of the yellow, and if I turn my paper here, I'm going to come to the edge of the seed head and just pull out some little hairs, just paint some delicate fine hairs. So I'll have to zoom in to show you this, but I'm just working right at the edge, nice and quickly, little flicky marks to pull out some texture on the seed head there. Okay, now the one in the background is a little bit darker, so I'm going to approach it slightly differently. I'm going to wet it first, as I did before, from top to bottom, being very careful around the edge of the poppy there, don't want to disturb that blue. Then I'm going to go into my dark green again, and I'm going to paint that across the surface. So I'm simplifying these seed heads. We're not sort of doing a photographic representation of them. This is a painting, isn't it? So I'm just simplifying it down. So this time I've got the dark green on first, and then I'm going to pick up some of my cadmium yellow, and I'm going to pull out some of those hairs at the edges, just as I did before. Turn your paper if you need to, creating these flicky hairs. But then also, if I just mix a bit more yellow, I'm going to go onto that seed head, and I'm dabbing down with my yellow now and disturbing some of that dark green, so it gives me a bit of texture there on the surface, because it's still slightly damp, so it's blending together on the surface. Now, I didn't paint the top of the seed head, so what I'll do now is go into the dark green and paint in that lovely shape right at the top of the seed head there with my dark green. Okay, and there's a few dark green specks around the shape of this one, so I'll just pop those in. It gives it some more shape to that one. And I'm going to approach the one right in the background that you can just see. I'm going to approach that in the same way I did this other one up here, because it's a lot darker. So just to show you again, wet with clean water. And then into my dark green and filling that shape. And then into, just cleaning that off, into my yellow paint and, excuse me, pulling out some very fine little yellow marks, yellow hairs at the sides, just a few, just to show those. And then immediately, before it has time to completely dry, disturbing the dark green with some of that yellow just by dotting it in. And hopefully you can see that that's created some texture there on the shape. So that's how you want to approach those. If you get some texture, that's, you know, some form of texture, that's what you're after. It doesn't have to look exactly like mine, of course. It's your own interpretation. The other thing we want to look at on those is that there's these lovely, I suppose they're the stamen from the centre of the poppy. So they're sort of coming off the bottom of the seed heads. So we can paint those in. I think what we'll do is let's use a touch of yellow ochre for this. So I know I didn't mention this at the start of the painting, but actually yellow ochre is going to suit this better. And I'm going to, I realised that obviously the stamen stalks, if you like, the lines are very pale, they're white effectively. Now that isn't obviously going to show up on the white background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the green for that. And let's switch back to the lovely vibrant Viridian green. So that's my lighter green colour. And I'm going to use the point of my brush, the very tip of my brush. Now this is completely dry, so I'm safe to paint on. And I'm just going to do some little lines coming out either side of this. Like that. Doesn't have to be exactly what you see. Again, this is just, you know, this is a representation of what we're looking at on the photograph. And then I'm going to use the yellow ochre, and I'm going to pop down some just little marks on the ends of these stamen. So the wind is picking up a little bit outside and it's making my door bang, so apologies if you can hear that. I've got the back of my house open to try and keep it all cool. So that's the rattling noise you can hear in the background. So you can see there we've just got a suggestion of some of those stamen. We can do the same for the others too. So I'll speed up the video now. The next step is to look back at the poppy flowers, and obviously there's a lot of lights and darks going across each of those individual flowers, and this is where we bring in the turquoise paint. So I'm just actually going to clean off, let's just clean off that cerulean blue that we used at the start. There we go. And let's mix up some turquoise. So here's my turquoise. And the mixture needs to be darker than the cerulean blue that I used to begin with. So these are now, so we've put the base down, if you like, look at it as a base coat, and that is creating the very lightest areas across those petals. Now we're going to work on top and bring in the darks and the shadows. So this turquoise needs to be darker than the cerulean blue. So let's bring that across here. And you can see that that is the original colour, the cerulean blue, and that is the turquoise I've just mixed. So it is darker than the first base coat that we created. And then what we'll do is we'll paint on wet in wet so that we get some nice soft edges. So I've got my wetting brush ready. So this is my number 8 round brush. Haven't used my number 10 yet, so possibly won't be using that today. So I'm just sticking with the 2 brushes, which is great. Now looking at the reference image, let's take the first poppy right at the top of the image. So we've got some darks, we've got a lot of folds going on. There's a lot of darks down the left hand side and across the right as well. Not quite so much in the middle. So we're obviously not going to recreate that exactly. We want to simplify it. Always think about simplifying your paintings. So what I can do first of all is I can clearly see there's a fold on this side, and I'm going to just wet the paper in that area, being really careful not to disturb the wash that's underneath. And I'm going to put down the shadow that I can see across there. So that's the turquoise blue now. Just popping that down. So I've got that down, and then while I've got the turquoise on my brush, actually this is a good part to put in some of those dark lines in the section above it. There's some shadows, but because they're small marks, we don't need to wet the paper first. So I'm just looking and I'm placing down a few of those marks just to signify those shadows at the top. Let's have a look then. So if we work to the next section to the right of that, we've got more marks, but I'm going to wet this area now because I want some soft edges to these marks. So we've got a little shape in there, and we've got some coming down here. So it's a case of working around your flower and looking to see where lights and darks are. I'm going to move across now to the next section, wetting it first. A little water and in with that turquoise, and anywhere that I finish my turquoise will be softened. The edges will be softened because I've pre-wet the paper. Now let's see, this side is quite dark, so just going to wet that. If you can't see where the water is, just have a look from a slight angle. Actually that's a lot of water there, so I'm just going to lift a bit off. Look from a slight angle and then you'll see it. And there's some light edges, so I don't want this blue to go all the way to the edge. So I'm dragging the paint into that water, leaving the very edges still pale. So the water does our job for us really. It softens that and makes it look more natural. Now coming down to the main body of the flower, just going to sharpen up that edge there. Let's see. And just sharpening up a few little edges there with the same colour. Got it on my brush. But now we can come to like the front, if you like, this front petal here. So what we've been working on there are petals on the back of the poppy and the side of the poppy here. So this is sort of the side. Now we're looking at the front. So in this case there's a big shadow on the left and another one coming up on the right, and in the centre we've got lots of little lines. Now to create those lines we'll work on dry paper, but first of all I want to get the larger areas painted in, so I'm going to wet those sections. That's a lot of water again, so just lifting a bit off. So let's get that one painted in first. So again there's some light edges right at the top, so I don't want the shadow to go all the way up. I've left a little pale section, and there's pale on the left hand side here as well, so just stopping it there. Just wetting a bit further across because I want to pull this paint over. So I'm really using my observational skills here as I'm going just to point me in the right direction where to put these shadows. Okay, so that's that side done. But like I say, in the middle we've got lots of little lines, so I want to be drawing the paintbrush towards me, but really gently dragging the brush to create fine lines. Now, I've got a bit of a tremor and it's quite bad today, so it may be quite tricky for me to create these lines that really should be sort of straight-ish. But I find the faster you work, the better and smoother your lines, if you like. So I'm just going to bring those down to the bottom. And then a sort of coming out and round kind of shape like that. So simplify it, you know, don't get too hung up on details. There's a lovely shadow across the side here which I want to paint in. There, bringing that lovely turquoise paint round, and it kind of creates the edge of the next poppy that's in front, so it describes that nicely for us. And then you can build up those lines across that poppy. Pop in some more blue in that section, just behind. But keep it nice and fresh. Try not to fiddle too much. I'm going to pop in, just going to carefully wet that section. So now I've got those lines in place, I don't really want to disturb them too much, but there is a slightly darker section at the top here which I want to capture. So I'm just working on the damp paper now and pulling down some of that turquoise from the top. So you still have a nice area of line work, and I want to paint in this shadow here. So I'm doing this bit on dry paper because it's a small section and it's reasonably dark as well, so actually I might go in with a second coat there just to get some depth. Okay, now let's just have a little look, just sharpen up that edge. I think you can go round and just have another look, see if anything needs pulling out a bit more. The shadow actually on this left hand side is a little bit darker, so I'm going in again with some more of the turquoise just on top of what I already did, but this time on dry paper to get the depth, the real depth of colour I want there. And just take that almost up to the edge, but not quite. That gives us that lovely shadow. There, that's better. So now we're getting sort of much more three-dimensional look. There's a couple of lines on this petal here which I want to just capture that I can see. So just popping those on. And I think really that's it. We don't want to do too much more, but that's exactly what I'm going to do for the other two poppies. I'll speed up the process and you can see where I'm looking for darks and lights and where I'm simplifying. Just to let you know, obviously we haven't painted the stamen for the two poppies here in the front. So what we'll do is paint those in after. I'm going to ignore them at the moment and just paint around the centres that we've painted in. and we'll come back afterwards and put those final details in place then. As you can see, I continued with the poppies, applying the turquoise in layers over the top of the original wash in cerulean blue. I used thicker paint each time I wanted to get darker, so you can see near the centre I've focused the darks there. It helps to give it a more three-dimensional look. The next step then, folks, really are the final details, which is working on the centres of the poppies. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the yellow ochre, which I'm just mixing up now in my palette. You want to have a real sort of thick consistency of paint. So this is going to be quite opaque. We want it to stand out against some of those dark blues. And I've just got it on my number 4 brush. And I'm just having a look at the reference image just as a little guide as to where to place it. But they're kind of dotted about. Have the dots touching and overlapping so that it doesn't look like a kind of a dotty pattern, but just dab that down and you can see that opaque consistency, it's really thick. If I just show you compared to the cadmium yellow, look how dark it is compared to the cadmium yellow there. So it's nice and thick, and it's going to show up against that dark blue that we've used, the turquoise there. So that's about all I would do on the right hand one. Moving across to this left hand one, we've got considerably more in view here. So if you just keep referring to your reference image and just build them up. Some of them are sort of little strokes actually rather than dots, so we can see them at different angles, so therefore you get some longer strokes in places, others are dots. So a little bit of variety is nice. And I've got a bunch just up here too. Building them in. Nice thick paint. And it sometimes helps to look from a slight distance as well and see what you've got. Sit back a little bit and assess what you've got going on. There, I think that is absolutely fine. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So I'm not going to paint in any of the lines of the stamen. So again, they're light, so that won't show up against the dark blue. So I'm not going to paint those in, and actually they're very faint anyway. What you would have needed to do was use some masking fluid to mask off that area right at the start, but actually I don't think it needs that. I think it's absolutely fine without. One thing I will do though is just work on the centres. We've got that Viridian green was the base, wasn't it? So that's just one flat wash. What we need to do is just add a little bit of shadow in there. So I'm just going to take a tiny bit of the darker green. So I'm using the Midnight Green for my darker green colour, and I'm just going to paint in some shadows where I can see it. So you've got overlapping petals that are hanging in front and shading the centres, so that's what's casting the shadow. And I'm using little dabbing techniques again to make little marks. Creates a bit of texture, and that's great. And then finally, just a tiny bit of these are quite light, aren't they, at the ends? I'm going to add a little bit of the yellow ochre just on the ends of those centres there. There we go. And yeah, I'm happy with that. Thank you so much for joining me today for this week's class. I hope you enjoyed painting these poppies. I thought they were super fun and we learned lots of different techniques. If you want to see another watercolour tutorial, you can catch me again next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Take care, I'll see you then.